You're listening to the Underground Voices Network. You will be hearing unfiltered truth from voices living the news.
Faith McDonnell is with us today, and she is the Director of Religious Freedom for Institute on Religion and Democracy. Is that correct?
Actually, it's the International Religious Liberty Program Director.
Okay.
And also the Director of the Church Alliance for a New Sudan.
Oh, wow. That's a long title right there.
It's a very long title.
Well, thank you for calling in and for being willing to share with us what is going on in Sudan, South Sudan, and of course in Nigeria as of late. And so I'd like to start off, with just asking you about your background and how you got started, and talk me through it, and your passion for the work that you do.
Okay. Well, it's a long story because I've been around a long time. But I grew up in a home that was Salvation Army. If y'all are familiar with the Salvation Army, that is actually a church, not just an organization that rings bells at Christmas and has stores. But my parents were Salvation Army officers. That means they were ordained ministers, and I grew up in that environment. Went to college. While I was in college, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I love English. I actually got a master's degree in English, but realized I didn't want to be a teacher. And there were several things that tugged at my heart. One was Northern Ireland, and through my church, Church of the Apostles in Fairfax, Virginia, I did 3 mission trips to Northern Ireland, and I had a wonderful time with the kids there, who are now my Facebook friends, who are in their late 30s and early 40s. So I wasn't sure what God was going to do with me ultimately, but what really struck my heart was when I found out that Christians actually in other parts of the world get persecuted for their faith. That was also when I was in college. I read an article about Christians in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and thought, wow, these are our brothers and sisters. And it never occurred to me to not think of them as anything else but our brothers and sisters. So to make a long story short, that's how it all started. And then by the grace of God, I ended up eventually getting a job where my passion could be my career and my life work. So I came to the Institute on Religion and Democracy in October of 1993. And I've been there ever since, and have been working, doing advocacy for persecuted Christians around the world, and for, other human rights issues as well. Like I was involved in the drafting of the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act, North Korea Freedom Act.
Wow.
There was another one that was not as much, for people other than Christians too, who are being persecuted for their faith. So I work with the Falun Gong people in China, with Muslims in Sudan, whoever, is being persecuted because they have religious faith, but particularly our brothers and sisters, because one of my mottos is Galatians 6:10, that says, do good to all, but especially to those who are of the household of faith.
Yeah, true. Very true. The work that we do is so a little bit about the organization and what we've done. Our organization is Azusa International, and the history behind that is long. It started off with a Christian human rights attorney, and she started off in northern Iraq doing work there with the Christians, the converts, who had converted from Islam to Christianity. And she started this organization to help support these brothers and sisters who had fled various parts of the Middle East and were seeking refuge in Kurdistan. And so from there on, it's kind of, most of its work has been, situated in northern Iraq. But we've, done work also in other parts of, the Middle East, such as Lebanon, Turkey, and the work that I specifically do there. But one of our projects, actually this project of ours that we've started, Underground Voices, is to get people such as yourself, people who are doing work either through advocacy or on the ground, what's what we call the boots on the ground, people who are right there in the action, assisting those who are being persecuted and getting their voices out, getting them heard. Because, in our day and age, right, we rely so much on the media to get our
Mhm.
information. And unfortunately, for yourself and for myself, we've both seen that sometimes the media isn't always accurate. And sometimes the media doesn't always portray what's really going on. And it really does a disservice to the people who need the assistance. And then it does a disservice to us as viewers, as listeners, because we're not being fed correct information. And for me, as a viewer, as a listener, it's frustrating, and it's very frustrating to know that there's, terrible stuff going on in Sudan. There's terrible stuff going on in Iraq and in Nigeria, but yet we don't hear about this on a daily basis. And so this project, Underground Voices, is to give a voice to people such as yourself, people who are suffering in those countries, and let our viewers and our listeners hear it for themselves, hear these direct sources. And so, you know, um, the work, obviously, you just shared a little bit with us about your work. But in terms of persecution and religious strife, from your perspective, if you can tell us a little bit about the need to bring awareness through government. You do advocacy, I'm sure it's through government too, but also through church advocacy and media. How does that play? What's, your perspective on that?
Sure. Well, Jennifer, what you all are doing is wonderful, and what Azusa International, is that what it is?
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah. Thank God for you all. I, have also done advocacy for Iraq and Syria as well. Starting back around, oh, I think it was around 2003, when there was a group of us in Washington who were trying and unsuccessful at this to get the new Iraqi constitution drafted without Sharia being a part of it. I don't know if you remember
I
that
do.
that failure, unfortunately, but there were so many other things, and to bring a voice for the Christians in Iraq and Syria, when it seemed at times that some of our U.S. diplomats and even people in the military weren't aware that there were Christians in those countries. Or I remember hearing that one, I think it was a colonel in the military, said, "Well, this is a Western religion." We were a Western religion when half of the Bible that isn't in Israel is in Iraq.
Right.
Abraham is from Iraq. All of these things that happened, Nineveh, Jonah. Remember the story of Jonah?
Yeah.
So this was very important. This is very important to help our brothers and sisters who are in the place where it all started. And I also have a personal tie, because a friend of mine from my church is a Syrian American who went back to Syria and started a Christian bookstore back in I think it was the 80s, on Straight Street in Damascus, and is now working to help the Christians who are being persecuted in Syria as well. So, yeah, what you said is very true. We work with the government, but a lot of times the government isn't ready to work with you. Regardless of who the administration is, there are still entrenched offices. In the State Department or other places, there are congressmen who have a lot on their plates, so this isn't maybe their first issue, although you and I both know there are some absolute heroes in Congress who just humble me, because they care about this so much, and it's their reason for being in Congress really was to speak out for persecuted Christians. So but as one of those congressmen, retired congressman now, Frank Wolf, always says, um, the Congress is downstream from the churches.
Hmm.
So if you can get the churches to be mobilized and to speak out and to be active, then that flows down to Congress. And
Right.
Congress suddenly sees all these people who care about the issue of persecuted Christians and persecuted believers around the world. So, and really now with social media, with what we've got that we never used to have, I would say that the churches are downstream from social media. So we have to get get things going on social media, which this podcast is great as for that. If people share things, if they are willing to share the stories when they find out the truth, don't keep it to themselves, but share it, then we can get some things to happen. One good example of that, and that you were talking about the media not always having the correct information, is with what is going on in Nigeria right now. I do a lot of work on advocacy for the Christians in Nigeria, long before hashtag bring back our girls or Boko
Hmm.
Haram even hit the scene. The Institute on Religion and Democracy was working to help Christians who were already then being persecuted in Nigeria, especially in the northern and middle belt. You divide Nigeria into, they call it the three belts: the northern, middle, and southern belt. And the southern belt is much more strongly Christian without persecution. I have to say, I wouldn't say just more strongly Christian, because the north is also very strongly Christian, but it's Christians who are being wiped out on a regular basis. But we have a strong tie because we do a lot of work in IRD with the Anglican communion around the world, especially in Africa. And there are 22 million Anglicans in Nigeria. So it's
Wow.
actually the largest population of Anglicans, I think, in the whole world. And it's the people who, when the churches in America who were faithful to the gospel were told, you either do what we say, consecrate gay bishops and marry same-sex couples, or you're out. The church in Nigeria and some other countries in Africa welcomed us in, and that was a real God thing, because it has made us so much more tied together. But anyway, Nigeria, you've got the media when they do talk about it, and there have been some stories in Christian media lately about the real bad attacks that have happened since the Nigerian elections, just in the last couple of weeks, and hundreds of people being killed. And they've only been in a lot of the Christian sources. You haven't seen them in the newspapers, on
Hmm.
CNN or anything like that. There's no mention of them. And even when the mainstream media talks about this issue, they tend to put it in morally equivalent terms. They say things like ethnic clashes,
Right.
clashes between Christians and Muslims, things like that equivocate the idea that Boko Haram and the Fulani, who have been weaponized by Gulf states with very high tech weapons to kill people, are deliberately targeting Christians. The head of Boko Haram once said, I would take as much pleasure in killing a Christian as I would a chicken. So
Wow.
that's the situation in Nigeria that we're asking people to speak out about. And in particular, right now, we want to see President Trump appoint a special envoy for Nigeria and the Lake Chad region, who would be somebody who could speak directly to our president, who would have a team that comes from all parts of our government, the Department of Defense, intelligence people, USAID. This is what was done in 2001 for Sudan. And the first Sudan special envoy that I was part of the campaign to push for that
Hmm.
was former Senator the Reverend Dr. Jack Danforth. And he was a great envoy for Sudan, and really was what helped lead to the peace agreement between the North and the South back then. And we need the same thing for Nigeria. We need somebody who has that kind of access to our president and who will speak out and collect people from different parts of our government who know the truth. And we need somebody who will be good, who won't be, squishy, who won't say, well, this isn't a religious issue, or this is a conflict between Christians and Muslims, as if the Christians are also, fighting against the Muslims when most of them are asleep in their beds when they're killed. So we need somebody who's not afraid to speak truth.
It's just, so shocking, when we do hear about what is going on in Nigeria, and then just the bits of pieces of news that come out from there. And, from when I was working in DC, I feel, that the issue is an ongoing issue, right?
Yeah.
And that was a couple of years ago when I was there. And I look at the reports and I look at what's going on in the news or what they report, and not much has changed. No improvement has been made. And then, of course, we talk to Christians here in the West and churches, and they don't even really know what's going on. They have no idea that, first of all, some people that I've talked to don't even know that they're Christians in Nigeria. And
Mm,
then when we do explain to them, this is an ongoing issue, there are Christians who've been there for many, many years, and regardless of what denomination they belong to, of course, but
mm,
but they've been persecuted for so long, and no one has ever spoken up for them. No one has ever defended their cause or advocated on their behalf. And the slayings keep coming, the rapes are still ongoing, the kidnappings. I mean, you just tell the horror stories, and they still don't understand, and to me, it's a little frustrating sometimes, and it's
mm,
heartbreaking, because if the church, I understand why sometimes government may not get involved in those issues, right? It might not be their agenda, and might not be their best interest. I mean, what they can come up with hundreds of excuses, right?
mm,
But when it comes to the church, I think that's where it really it really hurts me, and it hurts us,
mm,
that as a church we're supposed to be united and, be one body, and yet there's several parts of the body that are hurting, um, and we're very unaware of it. And
mm.
so, I've always said this, Africa in general is a place, is a region that is so forgotten. It is so forgotten. A lot of the attention goes to, you know, Asia or the Middle East, and rightly so, because there's so much suffering going on there too. But we tend to forget about our Nigerian, um, brothers and sisters, our Kenyan brothers and sisters, in general, our African brothers and sisters, everyone, all the Africans, all the African Christians who live there, and yet go through persecution, and it's under the radar.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just, so having someone, having you, and having, advocates out there who, you know, lift up their voices, use their voices to speak up on behalf of um, our suffering brothers and sisters in Africa is just amazing. And it's something that, I can't emphasize enough how much I appreciate, that we appreciate, to have people such as yourselves, who do speak up, who are not afraid to say what the truth, to speak up when it needs to, when words need to be said, and to not hide anything, to not to be as unfiltered as, as possible. And that's kind of what we're hoping to achieve with these podcasts, is to have unfiltered truth, raw truth be told and be said, because I think
Mhm.
it's about time that the church is aware of what is going on. So
Yeah,
thank you for
you're
that.
right, Jennifer. Well, thank you. And the church is going to be held accountable. If you want some raw truth, that's what I'll tell you right now. I think that the body of Christ that is free and not persecuted, but is, concerned about harassment or inconveniences or not being invited to the next party, or heaven forbid, even being banned on Facebook, which which was what happened to me
I
a few
saw
weeks
that.
ago.
Yes.
I was banished from Facebook supposedly for all time. Luckily, I got to change that situation. But any of that, that's nothing compared to what our brothers and sisters go through. St. Paul talked about momentary afflictions and light afflictions when he was being beaten and shipwrecked and finally beheaded. And he called those momentary light afflictions. What we have is nothing. And the church is going to be held accountable. I believe that, that when Christ returns, he's going to say, what did you do for my brothers and sisters who were suffering for their faith? And we better have a good answer for that. So I said before, Galatians 6:10, and that has been a motto of mine for many years. But in the last few years, I read a book that just blew my mind, because as much as I have been uh, determined that the church should be held accountable, this book just lays it out. And a friend of mine named Dominic Sputo wrote it, and it's got a kind of an odd name, Heirloom Love, but it's about persecution. It's the subtitle is Authentic Christianity in an Age of Persecution. And Dominic went through the whole New Testament and found the verses that we today have just like uh interpreted as meaning something else, that were the verses that had to do with the persecuted church, the church that was being persecuted by Rome, things like that. Like when we talk about where it says to give the gift of hospitality, it's not talking about inviting people after lunch, after church, to lunch. It's talking about the people who were fleeing from Rome because of persecution, and who were widows and orphans because the husbands had been turned into living torches for Nero or something like that. It's the verses that talk about giving, where Paul writes to other churches and says, "Can you give some money for these people?" It was because they were under complete suffering and persecution for their faith, and we have no idea. And I think I might not get the exact data right, but I think Dominic said that only 1.1% of all Western church giving today is given for the persecuted church.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
And
So I recommend his book. It has people who have read it have been transformed, and hold churches that he has gone to speak at churches. And one church he went to speak at, it was almost like all former Hells Angels in that church. and
oh,
and they were like selling their houses to give money to the persecuted church after they heard him and everything. Maybe they sold their hogs too. I don't know. But
I love the fact that you just mentioned, the Church of Acts,
mm-hmm,
and the church that was being persecuted in during Rome,
mm-hmm.
because to me, this, part of this desire to do this podcast and with Jimmy Cooper, who, by the way, is our producer, and he's the former band member of Petra, the Christian rock
I
band.
love Petra.
Yeah, I hope someday. I hope one day you and he can meet. He's just an amazing person, and of course, he's been producing these videos, and he takes interviews too. But one of our desires and is for this, our desire in our heart is to get the church to want to go back to its roots. And when I'm
Mm,
talking about its roots, it's its ancient roots, the Church of Acts,
right.
and that is my desire, is to be like the Church of Acts, be the church, that really practice what they preach. They were the church of love,
Mm,
and they were, under persecution in Rome, and knowing very well that if they left their homes, they could be caught and they could be arrested and tortured and killed. But they still took that risk to go out and, help others, and do acts of charity, and then of course bring them in and, share the gospel, share Christ. And that's how the church grew, in times of persecution. The church grew despite the pain, despite the persecution. The church was growing because they were doing what they were asked to do, and that was go out into the world and spread the good news. um,
mhm,
and so, for me, I think about, you know, the church in the West, and we are so comfortable. We're living in this bubble. And, I always say there's nothing wrong with building big churches. That's great. I love that. Um, but I think that we've kind of lost our focus, and we've abandoned, the mission. And that mission is to, to care for the least of these, to look after them, and and that's, to care for our brothers and sisters who are suffering, to speak up, to be a voice for the voiceless.
mhm,
And it's not so much that they don't have a voice, it's to empower them. It's to empower
mm,
them to use their voice. And that's, part of this project too, is to empower, those suffering, those who are going through this persecution, people such as yourself too, who advocate on a daily basis for Christians, to use your voice and to speak up, speak truth. Because I think that's the only way we're going to be able to mobilize the church. And so it's just, the Church of Acts is what my model of what I'd love to see the church, our modern day church to go
mm,
back to its first love. And so, with that being said,
mhm.
um, and you've been working in this field for, such a long time. How, let me ask you this, how is it that, with all the conflicts that arise in the world, you've got attacks here, you've got political, issues going on in our own country and in other countries. And so with all that, political, and just world conflict, global conflict, um, how, does it drift the attention away from the cases you work on, from the issues you work on? And if it does, how do you stay motivated when the news media and general public just seem to not be interested in the topic? And sometimes even when the church isn't even interested in the topic, like, how do you stay motivated?
Mm. Well, for me, in the last, well, for a long time now, it's been just so much a part of my life, so much a passion of mine, that I don't care who else cares. I mean, I really do care, but it's not going to stop me. And in fact, I joke sometimes that I'm like Johnny One Note, because I will bring the issue of the persecuted church, or the issue of Sudan or South Sudan or whatever, into every conversation, whether it has to do with that or not. So watch out, Jennifer.
No,
but
that's totally
but
fine here.
going back to what you were just saying though about the church in Acts, that there's a quote from somebody, I can't remember if it's biblical or somebody else, but they said the the church of in the Acts of the Apostles, they turned the world upside down. And they
Right.
really did. And, I see that happening with like the church in China, where they're persecuted and they suffer, they're imprisoned, there are even people killed, but they are turning the world upside down. They're going back to Jerusalem. They have their own missionaries going out
Right.
Silk Road back all the way to Jerusalem. And they and along with the Falun Gong, bless their hearts. And, I speak at their rally every year. They have a Freedom for China rally. And I love those people. But I don't know what they're dying for. They're being persecuted and dying, but they don't know Jesus. So I feel like I just have to be there with them and speak for them too. But they're helping people to renounce communism. They have helped over 300 million people in China to renounce communism. So truth is powerful. And, even when people want to hide it or people don't want to talk about it, the truth is going to come out. And then secondly, I'd say that for me, another reason is these are not just an issue to me. These are my friends, especially when we talk about Sudan and South Sudan, because I've been closest to people from Sudan and South Sudan. They're my friends. I could no sooner turn my back on them than on my own family. And when we start talking a little bit about South Sudan, I, you know, I have told people from South Sudan, because there has been this conflict now since 2013, which again, the media is totally distorting. And unfortunately, others, the UN, and even Ambassador Haley didn't really get it when she was at the UN, what's really going on there. But I've told the people, I'm not for the Dinka, because they will say, because I have supported the government of South Sudan's position of defending itself as a sovereign nation against armed rebel terrorists, and they say, oh, you're pro Dinka. I say, no, I'm not pro Dinka. I'm pro truth. And I want the truth to be told about South Sudan. So, there's that has made me enemies, even amongst people who were my friends in South Sudan. But I'm not willing to give up the truth, to make people, like me.
No, and I like what you just said, that you're for truth, because I think that's what's lacking in our media. That's what's lacking in just every aspect of life now, these days, is just people who will speak truth, either because they're afraid of the consequences if they do speak up, or they're afraid of being perceived as just not not being tolerant. I mean, just you name it. And I've heard people who, I have friends too in the Middle East who are against many of the issues that happen there, but they won't speak up because of what they're afraid, how they're afraid they're going to be labeled. And I understand sometimes, because I know their lives are in danger too the moment they speak up, and I know that it puts a target on their back. But to me, it's the people here where we don't have those issues. It's where we don't have that fear of being, persecuted to death, or imprisoned, or, tortured, or you name it. The most we would probably be is labeled as, intolerant, or, not accepting of others. But to me, that's not what it is. It's not that we're not being accepting of others. It's about the truth. It's about honesty. It's about what is really going on. And by keeping the truth, by keeping truth away, hidden in the dark, we're doing a disservice to humanity. We're doing a disservice to, others who are suffering. And that, to me, is just morally wrong. And so when we go and do presentations, we tell people, the truth now. We've presented it to you. Now you can take it and leave it, or do something with it, but you can never ever say that you didn't know, that you've never known, that no one ever told you. And so that is kind of what we leave people with. It's, we don't want to guilt trip people either, but it's presenting the truth. It's, the facts now. We've presented it. You either take it or leave it, but don't ever say no one ever told you.
Wow.
And that's a responsibility. And to me, I don't have a problem saying that to people. I don't,
No.
because, I tell people, someday, even for, to my friends who are unbelievers, I tell them, someday I will be before my Creator. And when I am before my Creator, I don't want him to say, to ask me, what did you do with the skills, the knowledge, the talents, everything that I gave you? What did you do with it? Did you some did you do something with it? Did you build something out of it? Did you at least try? I want him to say, at least, I know you did your best. You did what you could
Hmm.
with the information that was given to you, but not to say, you hid your talents. You
Hmm.
dug a
Yeah,
hole and
the
just hid
five
them.
talents in the Bible.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I feel that we tend to do that a lot here, and we tend to, and as Christians, and I will speak up, and this I will say, as a Christian, as a fellow Christian, I feel like many of my fellow Christians do that.
Mm.
And that's what, breaks my heart, and that's what it hurts me, is just to hear people say, well, we've got too many issues going on, for us to worry about what's going on over there, or I
Mm.
don't know, it's not my problem, or there's someone else out there who will do the work. um and there's no excuse. So, you know um with that being said, of course, I want you to tell me a little bit more, to tell us just a little bit more about, the suffering, both the physical and the spiritual suffering that, you've seen in Sudan, in Nigeria too, that you've heard, kind of enlighten us on what is going on there, both spiritually and physically, and how, um, and what you want the public to know, of course, and how we can assist that humanitarian need.
Sure. Yeah, that's really important. And what you said about them, for instance, in the Middle East, not being able to speak the truth because they could be killed. They have, the Bible does say, be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents too. So
Hmm.
they have that, justification, but we don't, as you
Right.
said, and we're supposed to be the ones. I always picture it being like, if there was a home invasion, and the person who came in and was the attacker was standing behind somebody with a gun, and they opened the door, to somebody who said, are you okay? And they would have to say, oh yeah, I'm fine, because the person is right behind them with the gun, you know
Hmm.
but if there was somebody looking in a window and saw that, it would be up to them to go to the police and say, no, they're not okay. There's something bad going on. It's the
Hmm.
same deal with the persecuted church. Now, when I first started getting involved, when I first came to IRD, actually in 93, 94, things were just starting to come out about Sudan more publicly then. And it's because the church finally said, you know what? Even if we die, we're going to tell the truth about what's going on. And they did, because we didn't have social media then. We didn't even have pictures of what was going on. We were getting
Hmm.
little reports that would be, take a long time to get to us, but nobody had smartphones. Nobody could like take pictures of what was happening and send it to us. With Nigeria right now, I'm getting pictures, horrific pictures every day. It's just it's horrible what's happening to the Christians in Nigeria. And this needs to be told, and needs to keep being told. And as I said, to reach out to Congress, and say to the president, we need a special envoy for that country. And spiritually, I know that it's hurting the people, as much as their faith is strong, they love the Lord, and they're willing to die for Him. But to not have their brothers and sisters speak for them, it's like
Hmm.
they say, does anybody care about what happens to us? Did anybody care about the Chibok girls? Does anybody care about Leah Sharibu, who is still being held by Boko Haram? It hurts. It
Hmm.
hurts a lot. And I'll tell you, I mean, most of the members of the body of Christ around the world who are under persecution that I've heard of, they certainly must have the gift of forgiveness, because they forgive. They
Yeah.
don't have. just forgive their enemies, the ones who are persecuting them, but they forgive us for being apathetic and inactive on their behalf and hurting them deeply, but they still forgive. So this is something that we need to change in this country. And I think, if we want spiritual revival to come in
Right.
this country, that's part of the key, I think, to revival coming, is when we, as Isaiah says, don't look inward at yourself, but focus outside yourself. When you share your bread with the hungry and clothe the naked, then the glory of the Lord will come on you, and it will be your rear guard, and you will be like a well-watered garden. That's when that happens, when you focus away from your own self and out to the people of the world, especially your brothers and sisters who are being persecuted. um, so that's let me tell you too, though, in terms of spiritual things going on, I just had an amazing conversation this week with Bishop Ndudu, who is the bishop of the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. And as you know, the Nuba Mountains have been through it. First, during the North-South War, the Nuba Mountains people were almost wiped out. And in fact, it was because of Senator Danforth being put into that position of Sudan special envoy that I think the Nubas survived. He
Mhm.
made a benchmark for the government of Sudan, to see if they were sincere about wanting to try and have a peace agreement. And that benchmark was, you stop bombing people in the Nuba Mountains. I mean, they were doing aerial bombardment both in the south, but especially in the Nuba Mountains, dropping bombs on people. People couldn't farm. People were starving to death because they couldn't uh, farm their land. The government was sending troops to burn the land as well as bomb. And then, after the peace agreement, it was okay for a bit. And then it started again in the Nuba Mountains. So even though the South was free and became an independent country in 2011, the government started attacking the Nuba again and has continued with that, as well as with Darfur. If people are more familiar with Darfur than they are with the Nuba Mountains, but it's the same situation. But anyway, the church is growing in the Nuba Mountains regardless of this. And my friends from Nuba are both Christian and Muslim. The Nuba Mountains are a place where I would say, I could honestly, without any reservation, say there is such a thing as a moderate Muslim, because these people are the same families. There might be one brother who's a Muslim and one who's a Christian. They go to each other's services, they respect each other's faith, they love each other. So the Nuba people are just incredible people, and that's why the Islamist regime in Khartoum doesn't like them, and issued a fatwa against the Muslims of the Nuba Mountains, saying you're
Oh,
not real
wow.
Muslims. Yeah, and that fatwa has never been rescinded. It has gone on, which is why they have attacked the Nuba so much. The Nuba fought with the South against Khartoum as well, and in recent years, President Bashir has also shown his racism by saying, we want to get rid of those black insects in the
Oh,
Nuba Mountains.
gosh.
So yeah, it's also an Arabist Islamist thing with Bashir and his people. But the church in the Nuba Mountains is strong, and Bishop Ndudu, who I started talking about 5 minutes ago, told me he was back in the Nuba Mountains just recently, and he confirmed 900 people. So these are people who were formerly Muslim and formerly practiced witchcraft.
Oh, wow.
Now they're Christians. They have given their lives to Jesus. And he also said many of them have been given a gift of healing, and they're praying for people and they're being healed. So I expect to see great things happen in the Nuba Mountains spiritually, even while they're, suffering from Khartoum, and from the fact that right now the United States is considering normalizing our relations with the Islamist government in Sudan. The Khartoum regime in Sudan has great lobbyists from Squire Patton Boggs who are getting $40,000 a month to make Sudan look good. And it had been working up until the time just a couple of months ago, I guess about 4 months ago now, when the people of Sudan, all the people, not just the people in Nuba Mountains and Darfur, but all the people started standing up against the government. There's been an uprising and peaceful protests to which the government in Sudan responded by shooting people in the streets and then chasing them when they are sent to the hospitals because they've been injured, going into the hospitals and shooting them in the hospitals. So I think that this is going to put the U.S. normalizing relations with Sudan on hold, I would hope. And also, I would like to see our government reach out to the opposition, the real true opposition, the people like the Nuba who have been fighting against Khartoum to protect their families, and realize that those are our true allies, not the Islamist regime, not these people who are, I actually have leaked documents from the meeting minutes of the parliament in Khartoum, and it has shocking things in it. It talks about making a way for ISIS to move through Eastern Africa, and
Oh
how
my.
to help Boko Haram, how to help El Shabaab, how to help
Okay.
Hamas. Just incredible. And yet we're acting as if we think we can have normal relations with this government and that they're going to give us real good intelligence on global terrorism. I don't think so.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's
Wow.
Sudan for you.
Yeah. That's just, wow. That's a mess.
Yeah. And
Wow.
they had been bulldozing churches as well,
Yeah.
and putting pastors in prison for their faith. And of course, a few years ago, putting Miriam Ibrahim, a Sudanese
Yeah.
mom and wife, in prison because they accused her of apostasy because her father was a Muslim. And Miriam, gave birth to her second child while she was shackled. Her legs were shackled in the prison, in a filthy prison in Omdurman, which is part of Khartoum. And God delivered that baby with no problems, even though they were afraid that she might have handicaps because of the way that Miriam had to go through labor, and then of course delivered Miriam from prison. Then a few years later, there was the Czech missionary, humanitarian worker, actually, who he was accused of being a missionary, and two other men, Nuba pastor and a Darfurian Muslim who was a convert to Christianity, and the three of them were in prison together in Sudan. And by the grace of God, they're all free now. So prayer prayer works. Well, God works. We have to
Mm-hmm.
pray, but God's the
Right.
one who does it. And this is spiritual warfare that we're involved in too, which I think, Jennifer, is actually one of the reasons why I love my work so much. Seeing God do these crazy things, and go into battle. Maybe because I grew up in the Salvation Army, but I really believe battling against Satan. So this is my gig, and I really am blessed to be doing it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, the spiritual battle thing, because I think we
Mm-hmm.
sometimes tend to forget that there is a spiritual component to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we think of it as in, political strife and religious strife and just ethnic strife and, whatever we want to call it, but we don't see that there's more underneath all of that. There's this spiritual warfare really going on. And it's interesting because we just did an interview last week with a missionary in Venezuela. And,
Mm-hmm.
we were talking during a conversation, and we were talking about, obviously what's going on there is the political issue of, the socialist regime and what they've done and how they've brought Venezuela down over the years, and then just complete decay of the country. But an interesting thing that he mentioned was, what he brought up was a spiritual warfare, is a spiritual battle that is really going on. And we see, the outside, the outer part, the shell, which is the political crisis, the total decay of the economy and the country and the government. But behind it is really something deeper and something more sinister, something truly evil, which is it's Satan at work. And he's using these basically they're his pawns, these political figures, these, the government, to bring down what God had created there in that country. And it's the same thing, I believe that there is a revival that's going to happen in Venezuela. I believe that Venezuela will rise up from the ashes, and it will be better than what it was before. It will rise up, but they have to go through the storm, because before the sun comes up, before there's sunshine, there will be a storm, and there has to be a storm. But it's the same with these other countries, with Sudan, with Nigeria. It's a spiritual battle. It's a storm that they're going through, because there's a revival, a spiritual revival, and a physical revival of the country that will occur. And I believe it. And I think as Christians, we need to see that. We need to really pay attention to that aspect that we tend to forget, that we tend to, not really pay attention to. And that's, it's shocking, because as Christians, we should know that behind everything, there's really something else going on. There's a spiritual warfare. So, we are not of this world. This is, this world is not, is in the dominion is of, Satan. And so, it's just, I was just, very, it was interesting to hear that you mentioned the spiritual warfare, just because I think I believe that there's something going on in the world right now, and it's a fight. It's truly a fight.
There is.
And I know many non-Christians, many non-believers will say, well, no, that's not it. That's just the way the world's always been. There's always been some, political issue. There's always been, wars, and it's true. But it's because it's a war, it's a battle for the souls of mankind. And as Christians, I think we need to be so aware of that, and we need to be prepared and ready, and just focused, and not lose focus on what is true and what is important, and why we were placed on this world. Why we were placed in this world, and that is to do God's work, to spread the good news, to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, who can't speak up, to be a voice. We as a country have been blessed with so much. As Americans, as Christian Americans, we've been blessed with more than anyone in this world can ever be blessed with, I believe. I've always said that the poorest person in the U.S. is the richest person compared to others in other parts of the world. And, to whom much is given, much is expected.
Yes.
And so we've been given so much: resources, knowledge, technology, rights, civil rights, freedom, religious freedom. And because we have all of that, we have so many blessings that we've received from heaven. We should not just sit on them and just cultivate it for ourselves. We need to do more with what we've been given, because someday, like, going back to our conversation earlier, one day God's going to ask us. He's going to ask all of us, what did you do with all of that? And so I'm just happy. I'm glad to hear, that you, and there are people out there like you yourself who are doing, who are not afraid to, put your name out there, and to put your face out there, and to speak up, knowing that it puts a target on your back, because it does. And so I thank you for that, Faith. Thank you for,
Sure.
thank you for your courage and for your, perseverance to do what's right and to push on even when others try to put you down or try to ban you from Facebook, which I think you should honestly, that's something that's a badge of honor, I think.
Yeah, and it turned out to be for the good. It increased my Twitter followers by about 250, and yeah, got me a lot more attention than I would have had otherwise, I think.
Sometimes it's so interesting how things that seem to not be working are really truly working in the background for good. When things are
Uh-huh.
just, and that's, it's going back to all of it. It's when things just seem like they're falling apart and it's just crumbling, it's because in the background there's something good going on, something,
Mhm.
God's up to something, and it's a war that's going on. It's a battle for our souls, a battle for humanity, and we're in. We should push on. We should continue the fight. And so, thank you for your courage to speak up. Thank you for, your faith,
Mm.
um, and for your willingness to share, your knowledge of what's going on in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Nigeria, and to share it with us, to share it with those who may be unaware or those who, you know, don't want to do anything about it. And with that said, what is
Mhm.
your how would you mobilize? What's your advice to the church on how they should mobilize?
Well, let me let me just go back 1 second too, though, on this spiritual warfare issue, because and this is one thing that I think that the church can mobilize on too, is for people to pray, not just to pray about these issues that I've talked about in these countries, but to pray that God would open their eyes and give them discernment. Because to get back to South Sudan, the spiritual warfare that has gone on over that country has just been staggering, Jennifer. It's been since before the country was formed. I have known that God had a plan for South Sudan. And you talk about blessings that the U.S. has, and just in terms of physical blessings, South Sudan could be feeding the entire continent. They have 4 growing seasons a year. They have the most organic soil, and yet people are dying of starvation right now.
Mm,
They have minerals. They have, of course, oil. They have teak and mahogany. They have shea butter, which I think, all the cosmetic companies in the world should be looking at South Sudan's Lulu nuts, which make shea butter. And yet everything's a mess, and it's because of this demonic attack on the country, and so much deception. And I'll make this really brief, but I'll just tell you, this is like a spy story. I was on the phone the day that the attack, the coup attempt started in South Sudan. I was on the phone with a military guy from South Sudan who told me what was happening. He said, "We've just been attacked by the troops of the former vice president. People were shot in their beds. Soldiers were shot in their beds. And yet, when it came out in the media, it sounded like it was a fight between two sides. Again, like I said about Nigeria, they make everything morally equivalent. And I kept thinking to myself, oh, well, the truth is going to come out eventually. The truth will come out eventually. And instead, the lies kept building and building and building until now it's like a tsunami that you can't even stand against. But right now in South Sudan, there was a peace agreement signed and things are going well. And you're not hearing that. You're still
mhm,
hearing, oh, well, peace agreement, it's going to fall apart and everything. Just pray. Tell people, people listening to this podcast, pray for South Sudan. Pray that it will be all that God intended it to be, that God will raise it up. There are verses in the Bible about Sudan and South Sudan, Cush, that say that the people of strange speech who come from the land beyond 2 rivers who are are tall and smooth skinned, and that sounds like the Dinka to me. I mean, I knew Manute Bol; he was 7'5", I think. So this is the tall people that I know, will offer their gifts to the Lord, and that is what I want to see. I want to see South Sudan offer its gifts to the Lord, its gifts of generosity and faithfulness and spiritual revival, and blessing the rest of Africa and stopping the spread of Islam throughout Africa, which is another reason why it has been attacked so much. So that's I guess what I would leave you with, that that's what the church needs to know. They need to know that we're involved in a battle, and it may not be at your front door, but it includes you, and it needs your participation. And it's time for the church in the West to really wake up. As you know, Keith Green used to sing, "The church is asleep in the light." Well, get woken up, folks, and do what you can to find out what's really going on and to help your brothers and sisters.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for
Hmm.
that. Thank you, Faith. Well, I think that concludes our podcast for today. So thank you, Faith, once again for sharing with us what is going on right now in Sudan, South Sudan, and Nigeria too, with uh, Christians and even non-Christians too, who are suffering persecution for their beliefs and for just thinking differently and believing differently than others and the extremists in those countries. So thank you again for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.